From the Swiss Alps to the Canadian Rockies, celebrating unique connections between Switzerland and Canada. Brought to you by the Swiss representations in Canada.
Welcome to the webcast From the Alps to the Rockies. My name is Urs Obrist. I'm the Senior Science and Technology Counselor at the Embassy of Switzerland. It is my pleasure to welcome today the co-founder of the Arctic Inspiration Prize, Arnold Witzig. Arnold Witzig was born in 1949 in a small town in Switzerland, was raised on a small family farm. After studying architecture and becoming the head of a small architectural company when he was 31, his career took off swiftly with his company, i.e. Engineering Group. But then, at the age of 50, Arnold Witzig said goodbye to his life as business owner in Switzerland and landed in Vancouver in 1999. Arnold Witzig is a philanthropist who has initiated the Arctic Inspiration Prize. The AIP is Canada's largest annual prize with a total of more than 3 million Canadian dollars as prize money. It is a great pleasure to have Arnold Witzig with us. So welcome, Arnold, to our podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join, and I just listened to my history, and you got it all.
Okay, we want to go a little bit more into details, obviously. And when we are looking at your life story, one is inclined to divide it into two main periods, be it from 1949 to 1998, and then from 1999 to today. Can you give us a bit of a background about your childhood and youth in Switzerland?
It's true. I actually grew up on a very small farm in Uwiesen, which is on the Rheinfall, on the Zurich side of the Rheinfall. So as children, we often went down to the Rheinfall, and there were many, many tourists, as you know, and we got some pocket money by jumping from this little platform right down in the wild water and to the big excitement of many tourists. So that's just a little bit of a small experience from home. My small farm was actually a very important experience for me. It meant, very hard work. You would say almost child labor today, but not absolutely not in a negative way. I learned a huge amount on this farm that was helpful for my entire life afterwards as a business person. So also to learn that when something is really good, you have to be aware that it's not granted. So a lot of this experience were really, really helpful for my entire life, especially my business life. And then another important thing, I think, I grew really up in this tiny community of Uwiesen, just about 800 people. And I really had the desire to get out of the farm, to get out of this community. So I ended up in Winterthur, where I was studying, then as it was called Technikum Winterthur. Mm-hmm. And then after I finished my architect's degree, because of several lucky and reasons, I actually was able to finish before my 21st anniversary. So I think I'm the youngest architect still in Switzerland, not because it was very smart, just because of some circumstances that all went for me.
Mm. And so you graduated, as you said, as one of the youngest, if not the youngest, Swiss architect. And what were the next steps in your career?
So I basically started just to work in a very ordinary architect's business that made basically residential buildings. And then I managed to be hired by the Neue Zürcher Zeitung when they needed to switch from the former production way to the modern electronic way, which meant from lead basically to the modern way, which meant completely different working processes throughout the entire production of a newspaper. And then I was hired basically as the coordinator for this project. All the planning, everything was done. The huge printing press was already ordered. And then when I started, I realized that all these drawings simply didn't provide what this newspaper in this completely new environment needed. And then I was in a very difficult situation. I went to the board and to the management and told them, you know, in my opinion, we need to start by zero. What you have now doesn't work. And then they unbelievably agreed, and we started all over again, and finally realized then this project. And that was a very crucial experience for me. So that brought me to the idea, instead of just being an architect, to bring together all these specialists that are needed for a complex industrial building. So I decided to find a company where I could introduce such a new model. Mm-hmm. And then I was lucky to be hired as a CEO soon after in a very small company that was actually in big difficulties. Once I started there, I realized they are actually on the way to bankruptcy. But that helped this bad situation to turn around the entire system and basically start to develop a completely new model back then in Switzerland, where you focus on industrial buildings. We started with printing industry because I had the most experience there. And then, you know, integrate printing engineers and others, and have them all enough knowledge about each other, so we could basically then provide a printing plant, a service that covered everything they needed. And this model turned out to be unique and successful. Mm-hmm. And then we developed it in other areas, like, for example, from printing plants to plastic, plants, mm-hmm. To life science, to food processing. These were all areas where there was a very strong link between architecture, construction, building, processing equipment, and so on. Mm-hmm. So this model developed, and we really became the number one in Switzerland in this specific target group industry.
Yeah, so one could say you were definitely a leading innovator in an area of industrial architecture projects, yes. Which nowadays people, I guess, take for granted. But yes. These had to be developed initially, as you said, from yes. the ground up, from point zero. And you indicated you were not only successful in Switzerland, you actually expanded with your company over the course of the next 18 years.
And when I then became close to 50, somehow my business goal was achieved. So a big success.
You decided to quit, and then comes the big cut, 1998 or 1999. You had indicated that you basically had achieved as a businessman. There was nothing more to strive for. Were there any other ideas why you wanted to break away from Switzerland, from your company?
I think I'm a kind of an entrepreneurial type and less a manager. I like to initiate something, to develop it to a certain level, and then basically it's not that interesting anymore when it's just continuing, to do the management of it. Mm-hmm. That was clearly the situation back then. Somehow my job was done. There were others who could take over. And so I basically had a completely white piece of paper in front of me. And I simply came to the conclusion I was the first 50 years of my life, mainly in Switzerland, but also other parts of Europe where we were working. And it's time, the world is large and wide, to simply go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And
then I did a bit research, you know, where shall I go? And I really could have gone everywhere. And I narrowed down to start with two cities. One was Vancouver, and the other one was a town in the US. And I somehow decided to start with Vancouver. Basically, you know, Canada is also a very beautiful country, has a democracy. When I flew from Switzerland to Vancouver, you fly usually via the north, meaning via Britain, then Greenland, and then the entire northern huge Canada, and then down the mountains back to Vancouver. And when you fly in this direction, it's always daylight. You know, you have it's only about 2 or 3 hours because of the time difference and so on. And I was extremely lucky. It was a clear, sunny day the entire way. And I still remember sitting on the window and then looking down to Greenland, you know, with the icebergs carving on the side, this huge ice plateau. And then the emptiness and the hugeness of the Canadian North with the Hudson Bay, and then NWT, then the beautiful mountains and Vancouver. So right on this flight, I decided the impression was so powerful. I right away decided I'm not going back to Switzerland. And soon after I landed in Vancouver, I sent a few emails and told my people back in Switzerland, that's it, I'm not coming back. And I'm still in Canada.
It seems like the young boy jumping into the water, new movies, and was ready to jump into a completely new environment 50 years later. Yeah.
Perhaps something like that, yes. Yeah.
And certainly from what I gathered, you have a strong attraction to nature. From what I've read in your curriculum, you're the second Canadian and only Swiss to ever have completed the Explorer's Grand Slam. Can you quickly explain what that is?
Yeah, that's a bit the crazy thing. That means basically that the members have climbed all the so-called 7 sommets, which is the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents, including Everest, and skied to the South Pole and to the North Pole. And when you do these both together, then that's the Adventure Grand Slam.
I want to come back to the topic of polar regions when we talk about the Arctic Inspiration Prize. But before we get there, basically once you landed in Canada, within 5 years, you got married to a person who has a very fascinating life story of her own. And would you mind sharing some of her background information?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, when I ended up in Vancouver, still I had no idea, you know, either to stay there or where to go. So I wanted to experience a real Arctic winter. So I flew up to Fairbanks in Alaska for the winter, just to really nothing else, experiencing a real northern winter. And I remember it was for more than a week, less than minus 50 degrees. It can be very, very cold in Fairbanks. It's like in a lake. And then above that is warmer, but below is really, really cold, but beautiful. And when I was up there, I was still trying to find a new partner, because my former partner in Switzerland simply didn't want to leave Switzerland, and I didn't want to stay in Switzerland. So we had to make a tough decision. So I was looking for a new partner, and that was just at the beginning of, partner search on the internet. At the very, very beginning. I think I was about the 50th guy there, and my wife perhaps the 30th woman, you know, and that's how we met. And then we had a very intense exchange. I was up in Fairbanks, she was in Vancouver, email exchange, and she is from a totally different background. She is a political refugee from Iran, who was first fighting against the Shah and then the Khomeini regime. And as you can imagine, right now, she is fully back day and night in what's happening in Iran. It's tough for her. And she basically got a so-called a death penalty, but a delayed one. So she basically managed to run away in Iran, came to Canada, and really sees Canada as the place that rescued her life. And she was still an activist then, student activist, and I was in Fairbanks as a former entrepreneur and capitalist, you know.
Quite the opposite.
Completely different backgrounds, but we pretty soon learned in this extensive email exchange that our values were actually very similar. And so then I soon flew down to meet her and then invited her to come up to Alaska for a few days. And basically, I fell in love with her before I even saw a photo of her. For her, it took a bit more time to, to experience or to feel the same, but it happened then finally. And then we went back to Vancouver, and I was still almost 50% of my time back then traveling for the first few years all across the world, doing this expedition, climbing the 7 summits and all this stuff. And
she also worked for NGOs, no?
Not back then. She was then still in Vancouver. And then basically I decided also, you know, we decided together that Vancouver would basically be our base. And then when she finished, she was studying her master's back then we decided we would like to explore in Latin America if we could do something like philanthropy. And we went there and we actually studied Spanish, both of us, because without that you really can't do much. And we focused mainly, and that has then a lot to do with the Arctic Inspiration Prize, we focused mainly on Bolivia and Guatemala. And both countries are the only ones where the indigenous population is still in the majority. However, Guatemala still, Bolivia has changed, always oppressed by basically, you know, the non-indigenous people who took over there many, many years ago. So when we were in Bolivia, there was almost a civil war, and we stayed in Sucre, studying English and you know, reaching out to people to do something in Bolivia. We really experienced this civil war. Sucre was partly burning. And we learned how difficult it was for the indigenous people to really take over, become independent, you know, become rulers and so on. And we saw then very many similarities to the situation with the indigenous population in Canada, which nowadays everybody talks, everybody in the media, you know, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and result. We have the issues with the residential schools. Everybody knows that now, but back then when we started with the AIP, that was all a little bit new.
And so, you established a prize in 2012, right?
Yes. So when we worked in especially Bolivia, somehow we were a bit disappointed about how NGOs work abroad. You know, by studying Spanish down there, we were really there and could talk with people and so on. And we just were not convinced that many of this work is done the way it should be done. And then we suddenly came to the conclusion, why don't we do something in Canada, our homeland of choice? And with Seema, coming from this background from a developing country, actually living in a minority of Arab background, oppressed by almost everybody else. For her, the understanding of the situation of the indigenous population in Canada was very obvious and almost personal life. For me, it was something I had to learn first.
And from the other perspective, probably from the indigenous perspective, they might have wondered, oh, what do these Southerners want from us? One from Switzerland who probably doesn't know much about the North, and yes, your wife as well. How did that come to interact? How did you establish connections with the Northern?
Yeah, I probably need to say first a bit why we established the Arctic Inspiration Prize. We could also just have gone there and see what projects are out there and then support some of these projects like what NGOs usually do. Mm-hmm. So I think there were several reasons to do it. Clearly, Seema's background and understanding this indigenous situation. But also our experience, as I mentioned before, in Latin America with the situation of the indigenous population there. And then my love for the North and the cold and the emptiness, and also my experience traveling in this very, very tough environment, being to the South Pole or being to the North Pole. I really learned to appreciate and understand how this indigenous population in the past was able to not only to survive, but basically to strive in this really, really tough environment. And to survive up there, and really, I'm still extremely impressed about the knowledge and the abilities of these people up north. Mm-hmm. So I think this understanding what these people are really able to do and do every day helped somehow to come to the conclusion we should simply ask them what they want and what they need, and then simply trust them and help them or support them in what they want to do, instead of being in the South and say, okay, we have an idea how you could help, please, let's do this project together. Mm-hmm. That's completely wrong. It just doesn't work. So back to the Arctic Inspiration Prize. First of all, it's not something that looks backward. We don't honor somebody who has achieved something in the past. It is funding to inspire people to do a project in the future. So I think that's much more challenging, because you need to know then, what these projects are and so on. And the second thing was never for an individual. It was very clear from my own life experience, teamwork is needed. Mm-hmm. So the Arctic Inspiration Prize is only for diverse team who work together, can be grassroots, government, industry. And the last one, it's not called the Seema and Arnold Prize, like, mm-hmm. The Nobel Prize. It's called the Arctic Inspiration Prize. Because for us, it was clear from the very beginning, it has to be something the Northerners fully take over, take the lead, take the ownership, and really run the whole project, and not somebody from the South. That was the very goal from the very beginning. and I can tell you in a nutshell, and that is the vision of the AIP that was developed by the Northern Trustees of the Arctic Inspiration Prize Charitable Trust. The vision is not, you know, something like, how can we help Northerners? That's always how people talk, that people in the North need help. The vision of the AIP, again, formulated by the Northern Trustees, is a stronger Canada through the experience and the values of the peoples of the North. What the difference? You know? And you can see the pride again, and they deserve it. And the other thing is also, you know, everybody talks nowadays about reconciliation. And it's just about time in Canada. And basically, the AIP is really regarded as an example of successful reconciliation because North and South, Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals and groups work together, collaboratively and respectfully. And that was always our dream, you know, to have North, South, across the Arctic, groups and people really work together on one single goal. And that's why also it's called by the North, for the North, and very important, with unconditional support by the South. We don't want to have Southern partners who are just interested for their own advantage. The Northerners have experienced that enough. They should really understand that's what they do here is part of reconciliation. That's basically probably the principle, yes, of the AIP.
And that's very amazing, like for an outsider and an outstanding or a person looking from the outside into this project or the prize as such. I can see the governance structure nowadays has changed as well. You yourself have pulled yourself rather out of the governing roles, if I understand correctly. So the principles that you establish are really, the focus is by the Northern people, for the Northern people.
Yes.
And that might sound a bit strange, I would imagine, for some people to say, well, why or how do you do this?
So basically, when it comes to this by the North, we have now a board of 11 board members. And I'm the last one of these 11, plus a philanthropy representative who is a Southerner. All the others are Northerners. So that's the board is completely controlled by the North. They need majority. They are the chairs and the vice chairs and so on. And then in order to find the projects, we have ambassadors across the Arctic, literally in every single remote community. And this is very important because only when you are in such a community, you can see what's happening on the ground, what is needed, and encourage then grassroots teams or others to come forward with an application for the AIP. Then we have 3 regional selection committees because remember, the Arctic is as large as entire Europe, you know, the Canadian Arctic, but it has only about 120,000 residents. And now to choose, you know, when we have nominations from across the Arctic to choose the best ones, if you have somebody from Labrador, to choose a project in Yukon is impossible because they have no idea. It's like Moscow chooses something that should be done in Lisbon. Yeah. So that's why we have regional selection committees, one in Yukon, one in NWT, and then one for the area that is called Inuit Nunangat, basically the area where the Inuit live. They then choose for their areas the finalists, and then it goes to a national committee who then choose out of the finalists the laureates. So this is a completely Northern-led selection process of the winners each year, which we are then going to celebrate. And then, of course, we have prize partners who support, you know, the prize money. And we have so-called co-owners. And these are about 30 develop indigenous owned development corporations from the Yukon to Labrador, and each of these groups have their own representative in the board. So imagine there are about 30 corporations and, you know, indigenous governments from across the Arctic are all and are invested in the AIP, and they are the leaders and the owners of the AIP. And then we have, you know, all the federal government is part of it, all the Northern Territory governments, basically all the indigenous self-governments, they are all also part of the AIP family, invested in it and so on. So in other words, it's meanwhile a really huge network of Northerners from all across the Arctic. And then many from the south, like industry, businesses who have stakes in the Arctic, they also are part of it as prize partners and contribute additionally to the trust, you know, for the prize money each year.
But that's also without conditions.
Yes, that's the part unconditional. And actually, companies locally start more and more to understand this.
Mm-hmm. And you have mentioned the ceremony. I had the chance to attend several award ceremonies. Tricky question maybe for you, but when you look back, what exactly or which of the projects, when you look back, would you say this is exactly what I set this prize up for in the first stages? I mean, if I understand correctly, you have put forward roughly $60 million for this Arctic Inspiration Prize. And yeah, it would be of interest to hear from you, maybe 2 or 3 projects where I said, this is really what I think is what I wanted.
I need to answer that in a bit different way, because it's basically not possible to answer it that way, because that would mean we personally, again, in this wrong way as Southerners, think what is really good and what do we like they should do. And that's why I really can't answer the question that way. But what I can say, we could clearly see in these 11 years now, how the subjects of the project team, you know, the projects, what they want to do has changed. In other words, you can directly see what are the present needs and opportunities in the different communities in the north, and that is then what's coming out as a project. For example, this year, one of the 1 million finalists, and I can't say the laureate because they only learned that on February 8th, but one of the finalists is an Inuit Nunangat-wide project, basically focusing on mental health, suicide, you know, prevention and all these issues. So for a couple or 3 years, probably, this mental health thing is a huge element. There were times where food security was very important. So we had, for example, Wieners 2 in Yukon, where they established with Southern Science support a greenhouse that even works in the winter in the Arctic. And another, you know, farm that was developed a little bit further south in the Yukon. So it really shifts and follows the present needs. So it's not like, you know, government programs often address something when the need already has gone. They're always, you almost can't change it. It's just how it is. And it seems we manage with the system of the AIP by seeing the shifting topics of the projects that they really address the need of the moment. And that's basically what we hope to see.
Time is unfortunately already up. I would like to thank you, Arnold Witzig, for your participation in our podcast. And I wish you a successful Arctic Inspiration Prize award ceremony.
It was a pleasure again. Thank you so much for having this chat with you.